next is Gallagher's State of the Sector report, which they're calling this year the Employee Communications Report. So the state of the sector has been in our industry for a very long time, but now the Employee Communications Report. So this is from Gallagher. It is a global report. So 36% are from organisations under 500 employees. About 64% sit in larger businesses, including 20% in enterprises of 10,000 or more. Public health and NGO is the largest single sector in the report at 22%, but it's far from dominant. So the lens is quite broad here, but it's still very heavily North American and UK. Now, this year, the report is themed around the readiness gap, and this is the widening space between the risks organisations face and the capability of internal comms and HR teams to respond. Now, on the surface, this sounds very new, but in reality, it's not. So this gap has always existed. What's changed is the intensity. So the amount of change that we now see in organisations, the rising burnout that's happening, 81% cite it as a significant risk, as well as escalating volume. They've exposed structural weaknesses that were previously easier to mask. So this readiness gap is, for me, is a bit of a marketing term for something that's already been there. In the report, it talks about the fact that strategic ambition remains really high. So 73% want to operate as strategic partners, yet only 18% believe that they're there. Now, the report makes a very strong case that codified socialised strategy reduces risk and improves engagement, which is important for people that are really pushing for clarity and governance. This piece around risk seems to be a bit of a thread through multiple reports, actually, that we've looked at this year. So this sort of ambition, strategic ambition, the gap between that and actually where people are is kind of the core message of the theme. Once you get past all of the graphs and the buckets and the segments and all of that stuff in the report, what they're really saying is that maturity of the function is what's going to have the biggest impact. It's not about more channels. It's not about more content. It's not even about AI. The teams that are coping best with complexity aren't facing less change. In fact, they're probably facing more, but the difference is structural. So they've got a strategy that people understand and use. They have clear visibility of what they're accountable for. They have governance around their channels and AI. They have audience discipline, so segmentation, listening, manager enablement, and they are measuring outcomes, not just clicks. Now, all of that combination is what plays a role in these functions being better equipped to deal with some of that organisational risk. It reduces burnout, overload, the erosion of trust that's in the organisation. The report shows repeatedly that when strategy is socialised and active, engagement trends improve and this perceived risk goes away. So this stat of 73% want to be seen as strategic partners, only 18% are operating that way. This is what they're calling the readiness gap. Really, it's an operating model gap. And that's the bit that people need to kind of look at. There are a lot of teams we often talk about that are still functioning as this sort of broadcast hub, the sort of reactive service desk. That is nearly always because of structure, capacity, or lack of governance. So it's important to focus on that if you want to get to that 73% of being seen as a strategic partner. The report does also talk about change being a now core skill. I mean, to be honest, for me, it's always been a core skill, but now it's definitely a core skill. But the other thing that they're talking about is clarity. So it's important that if you want to be seen as the strategic partner, you're anchoring your function in the strategy, governance and audience rigor. Because if you're not doing that and you're starting to use AI will just make you faster at being reactive. It won't help you deal with the challenges that you've got. The volume will just continue to erode trust, and that's not what we want. So we've got to do that work to really make a difference. Now, Chuck, this report is always a big report for the industry. Lots of people always talk about it. What were your sort of biggest takeaways from reading it? Because I'm sure you picked up on a few other bits than I did.
Man, for one, pour one out for the state of the sector. I didn't even know we were getting rid of that name. That's been a legacy thing in our industry for such a long time. But for me, and this for the report now formerly known as State of the Sector, it has always been this like, yes, but type situations. And I remember going back to very early on, it was communicators identified that managers were critical to the success of communications, but nobody was actually doing anything about it. And I don't know, what's a what's the plural of paradox? Is it paradox? Is it
Paradigm?
paradoxes? I don't know. There are multiple of those. And this, again, one of those is around change comms, which you talked about, Jenni. They rank it as the number one skill, but more than half have no formal change comms approach. So you recognize it's important, but again, not do anything about it. Another one was only 18% are satisfied with their ability to personalize content to audiences, which a report goes in and talks about how critical that is to the success of communication. But 70% do not regularly use personas or audience profiling. So we know it's important, but we're not doing it. So for me, if you're reading this report, use this as a time for some self-reflection or some team reflection. Because Jenni, you talked about this readiness portion of the report. It recognizes there's 4 different types of teams that are out there. There's vulnerable, untapped, resilient, and stable. And if you look at vulnerable and untapped, those are more than half of the respondents. So vulnerable teams are drowning. They're not tracking what they're accountable for. They don't have any visibility. Untapped teams have a false sense of security, low risk perception, but also low capability. Like, I don't think anybody wants to feel like they're a part of being vulnerable untapped teams, but yet half are. So what are we doing to become, even the resilient teams aren't necessarily, they're on the way to getting better. They're on the way to stronger. And then the stable teams, those are the ones that have cracked the code. They're strategic. They're tracking what they're responsible for. Like, how do we, those people that are in the vulnerable, untapped teams, how do you start to shift your way? That's what I want this self-reflection to do for these teams.
I think the other thing for me about this report, and I talked about the jargon that was used in the IOIC report, which I felt made it quite hard to really figure out what we're trying to talk about. This one for me, if I think about state of the sector when it started, and that used to belong to Gatehouse before they were acquired by Gallagher, it was such a useful report. And I'm not saying that the report is not useful now, but what I am saying is it doesn't feel as useful. So I was asking some people, like, what do you use these reports for? Because again, I was reading it thinking, what am I doing with this? Like, how is this helping me? What am I meant to be doing with it? And everybody came back and said, the people that I spoke to said, I use it to benchmark. Like, that's generally what I use it for. And I hate benchmarking because I think it's really dangerous in terms of you have your culture, you have your number of people, you have your industry. Like, it's so different. And I think that makes benchmarking very difficult. They've done a good job in this report of trying to break that down with sort of deskers and frontline workers and different industries. But I still feel like if I was working in an internal comms team today, what am I going to take from this report that I can really practically take away and do something with? And I think, to your point, it's that maybe that looking at that risk piece and where you sit in there, but also that capability gap and actually doing the work that's going to help you become strategic and making space for that. That's the takeaway. You almost don't need to read the report for that. You've got to make the time to do the work to enable you to be that strategic function. Otherwise, we're going to continue to research, report, repeat, and we're not going to see any change.
The other big takeaway for me was around, it talked a lot about volume and like how much content communication and comms teams are sending out there. And I want to go back to this audience thing around the segmentation and tone. And are you sending content or delivering content in ways that mean something to the audience? And one of the things they cited out was you can reduce information overload and burnout by just simply targeting content, by just simply giving people the information that they need in ways they can use it. Where we tend to see like information overload is like, oh, nope, dial it back. No, it's actually target it, personalize it for them. I think, again, it's what are these lessons that communicators and those who communicate can learn, that it's not just about stop doing something, it's how do we then do it better?